go! They're rolling. I take a scene one, take one, take two.
Okay, hello again. True to my promise, we're about to start. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce today's guest of honor, Harry Pincus. I first met Harry shortly after Louis and I moved into this loft. Together with Charlotte Fall and Dan Schneider of the Florence Belsky Foundation, we hosted a series of events to raise funds for the Harlem Jazz Foundation, the America the Beautiful Fund, and other worthy causes, to which Harry was a generous and regular contributor. As you are soon to witness, Harry is a highly talented, widely published artist and illustrator, as well as a world-class raconteur. So without further ado, I give you the inimitable Harry Pincus.
Thank you very much. I feel like the ashes that are following my work around. My work grew out of my life. I really don't have any academic expressions for what kind of work I did. I never thought consciously about the technique. It just evolved. I was born in Brooklyn, New York, and as you can see, I had a miserable childhood. It was really a very nice place. I mean, there was a beautiful hospital across the street called the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital. Obviously a name that was created by a brilliant public relations firm. When you put together the words Jewish and chronic disease and hospital, you're obviously selling. And we were right across the street in the highly elite Butchers Union Co-op. Otherwise, Brooklyn was really an incredible place. That's my father. He was a subway conductor and a free thinker, and he didn't have the benefit of an education because it was the Great Depression and he had to drop out of school. When I first came to SoHo, I told him, look at this beautiful neighborhood, look at these beautiful buildings, and he just hated it. He just kept saying, you and your roofs. I couldn't get a job here in the Depression, no how. I used to go from door to, they wouldn't hire a Jew in this neighborhood for anything. He applied for something called the Superman list in 1938. 80,000 men applied for 1,400 jobs to become sanitation workers, because to have a job in 1938 was that important. And he trained for 6 months, and he could lift a 100-pound garbage can and climb a 6-foot wall. He was a very enormous influence in my life, and I miss him very much. And he taught me realism. He was, above all, I would say, a realist. My mother was named Blanche Black, and maybe that's why I'm a black and white artist. I got my storytelling and my sense of literature, I think, from her. Her father, my grandfather, Harry Black, was just a kibitzer in the Yiddish theater. So she remembered sleeping on the floor under Molly Pecan's table on 2nd Avenue while the old men played cards all night. And my grandfather inexplicably was buried by Murder Incorporated. We don't know why. But he used to hang out in their candy store. And he was beloved. He was a great storyteller. He was really born in 1873, and he was a house painter. So by the time the Depression hit in 1930, he never could work, because who was going to hire a little old man with white hair in the Depression? So whatever he did to survive, when he passed away, the guys came from, the tough guys came from Murder Incorporated, and they walked in, the family was sitting shivering. They plunked down a big envelope on the table, and they said, you know, we love Pop, and when he went in for the operation, he forgot this in the candy store, and they paid for his funeral. So this was a drawing for the New York Times, but it expresses how happy my parents were that I avoided institutionalism. They were so happy that in the institution I had landed in was the New York Times rather than a prisoner mental institution. This is an etching on a copper plate of Coney Island. And I grew up in this wonderful Brooklyn. where we were actually very naive. You know, we didn't really care about condos and sports cars and $300 bottles of champagne. And on a summer's weekend, you would literally have 2 million people on that beach. And people were essentially naked under the sky and the sun. And we were just there for the sand and the ocean. And we were all of a tribe of Brooklyn people. And it was really an amazing thing. And I'm just barely old enough to really remember that. And it's a wonderful memory. And my father was a handball player out there. My grandparents lived out there. So I spent a lot of time, and it was a great salvation. My parents had a failed marriage, so the beach was the sort of place to go to open up and get away from that. This is a drawing I did for a Jewish magazine called Hadassah. And I immediately lost my job when I told the art director that I was forming an organization of Jewish men, and I was going to call it Harassah. So this was a one-time appearance in Hadassah. This drawing is sort of about the New York, the Manhattan of the early 1970s that I arrived in. And this guy, he's holding the $5 bill because it cost $5 to get a flop on the Bowery at that time. And he was homeless, and a friend of mine introduced him to me, and I gave him the $5. And he held it up and he looked at it, and I saw that there was an Abraham Lincoln on it. And I thought, how strange. And I said, can I take your picture? And it's based on a photograph I took of him. In the early 70s, I had met a French girl in a frozen commune near Flatbush Avenue. And I didn't know that this urchin was rebelling against her aristocratic family. Back in Paris, her friends were baronesses, and her father was in charge of a huge corporate position. And we lived innocently, and we needed an apartment at one point, and she'd found an apartment on Ludlow Street for $56 a month. So we took the apartment. We didn't invest in electricity, so we lived by candlelight on Ludlow Street. One night I came home, and she told me that there had been a man at the window. I said, a man at the window? She said, yeah, a man with a knife. I said, a man with a knife at the window? What did you do? And she said, oh, man. I said, go away. I said, what did he do? She said, he didn't go away. So I said, what did you do? So she said, I said, man, go away. I said, what did he do? She said, he didn't go away. I said, what did you do then? She said, I said, go away! And I said, so what did he do? She said, he went away. Then we found a place down here, and what we paid as a down payment for the entire building, movie stars pay that much rent for 1 month now down here. And so I've been there ever since, many years. I was very fortunate in that regard. These buildings down here, before they were cleaned up, were very amazing. So, for example, this wall, if you were to look at it today, it's covered with dirty concrete, and there's all these air conditioning units, and it doesn't have any of this beauty that it had. She probably still looks the same, though. I was trying to find myself. Sound like Janis Joplin. And it was a time of a tremendous upheaval, of course, the 60s. I became very politically interested when I was a child. John Kennedy came to our neighborhood, and I met John Kennedy. And he pointed out to me, and he smiled and looked right at me, and he laughed. And I felt like I'd been touched by fate or destiny. I became interested in politics. There was so much going on, and I wrote letters. And then I went on and really didn't know what to do. I didn't have any career guidance from my family because we were really out of it. And we were actually out of it. We were evicted at one point with my dying grandmother. I like to say that that's when I learned to see the beauty of realism, as I looked at all of our worldly possessions out in the bright sunlight in front of our building next to my dying grandmother on a gurney. I've always been moved by realism, by that which is. And I went to Hunter College, we shut down Hunter College in 1970. We had 2,000 kids marching on the streets around the school. I ran up to the art. Oh, you were at Hunter?
Yeah, that's at that time. Yeah, I was one of your 2,000 kids.
Oh, you look a little familiar. Did I ever come on to you?
No.
You weren't there then. My wife looked at my transcript from Hunter College, and she comes from an academic family, my wife Monica, and she said, "You call this a transcript? Look at this. Women in Film 101. Nude women in film 101. Women in art 101. Nude women in art 101. Women in Revolution 101. Nude women in Revolution." That was my education at Hunter College. We brought Abby Hoffman to the school, and Abby Hoffman jumped up on a table in the cafeteria, and he said, "What we need here is not more Jewish mothers. We need more Jewish motherfuckers." So we shut the school down, and we had all these kids marching. I ran up to the art department, and I made a fiery speech. "You can't be artists from a white ivory tower. Join us at the revolution. Kick in all the jams." And I ran back down, and the teacher told the class that what I really needed was a girlfriend. I didn't want to take regular classes, so I got into something called the CUNY Baccalaureate, which was an independent study. And I bought a flower truck in Brooklyn. It said, "Say it with flowers" on the back. And I threw a mattress in the back of the street. And the French girl and I lived in this thing for 7 months, and we went 17,000 miles. For a while, we traveled with a group called the Yay God Bus. And the Yay God Bus, I really learned a lot from that, because they were about losing your ego. They were coming to New York to see a guru named Sai Baba. But we met them in Colorado, so they had a friend who had a goat farm in the Rocky Mountains, so we all ran around naked in the Rocky Mountains. And we practiced speaking, we practiced living in silence and taking on different names and losing our ego. Then when I came back to New York, I didn't have an ego anymore. So fortunately, in those days, you didn't need one. So I didn't know what to do in my life, and all of my friends knew I was an artist before I did. So they said I should go out on the street and do portraits. I had hair down in here and a beard. So I went out to McDougal on 8th Street, and I sat on a little stool, and I had a pad, and I sat there, and I was terrified. And another artist came by, Norman, and Norman was like unbelievable. He wore a white, pristine white clothing like Robinson Crusoe, and it was all perfectly frayed at the edges, and he had a straw hat, and he had his pad, and he sat down next to me, and I immediately started to flee. You know, "Hey man, this is your spot. Like, I'm not messing with your spot." And he looked at me and he said, "Where you going?" I said, "I'm leaving. It's your spot." And he's, "You ain't going nowhere, motherfucker. You know, I've been watching you. I've been watching you. And they're walking past you, they got corn in their hair. They're coming to New York, they got corn in their hair. And they're looking for the real thing, and they're walking right past it. You the real thing. You ain't going nowhere." So he inspired me to stay on the street and do portraits for $5. We actually put him up in our place for a while. He had a little bit of a drug problem, which my neighbors didn't appreciate. But one day, I was supposed to meet my father out there, and I was doing a portrait of a bum. And he was sitting on a garbage bag, and I was sitting on a garbage bag, and he was telling his life story about how he'd been a chef on an ocean liner in the 1930s. And a big crowd gathered around. I was drawing furiously, and my father showed up. I was supposed to meet him there. And a woman said to my father, "That kid could be a great illustrator." So my father said, "I'm his father. What's an illustrator, and what should I do with him?" Now, I should say, in the meantime, when I was 18, my father had cancer, and they thought he was going to die. And I was there every day, but one day I brought a friend who was a real hippie with a beard down here and Nepalese hats and things. And when my father saw that guy, he shot up in the bed, and he said, "Excuse me," he could barely walk, and he takes me over to the corner, and he says, "I can't die now. I can't die because you're so screwed up. I'm not gonna die." And then he was supposed to die, and then he got a check from the Veterans Administration. It was a $5,000 check. But the other piece of paper with the check said, "You have terminal cancer, and you're 100% disabled." He was a World War II veteran. So I'm looking at the letter that says you have cancer and you're terminally ill, and I look up at him and he's waving the check. And I said, did you read the letter? And he said, yeah, fuck him. I ain't got cancer anymore. And he lived another 24 years. And we inspired each other because the more I succeeded as an artist, the more he became healthy and happy. And the more he became healthy and happy, the more I succeeded as an artist. It was a very magical thing. And so he took me to the School of Visual Arts, and they put me in an illustration class. And the teacher said to me, you're the next Brad Holland. And I said, who's Brad Holland? And he said, I am. I didn't realize that it was a great compliment because Brad Holland is a great, great illustrator. And he sent me over to the New York Times. So I was 23 years old, and I'm at the New York Times. And by the time I was 24 years old, I was doing drawings like this in the Week in Review of the president, and it was very overwhelming to draw the president of the United States. Now, oh, by the way, the body on Jimmy Carter, I used an unknown weightlifter named Arnold Schwarzenegger. And I was trying to draw little swastikas in the veins. And the art director came over, and he was looking at it, you know, what is all that? And he sees my signature there. This is the 70s, and he said, what does that say? And actually it says Harry Pincus, but I told him it said, fuck the New York Times. So after that, I had to print my name on it. But it was the 70s, you know, I mean, they were hiring a guy like me. I was wearing a shirt that my mother bought for 25 cents at a bazaar in Brooklyn and hand-stitched. You could see the Frankensteinian stitching. And I was coming in there with a drawing of the president. I was taking a picture of myself in the 25-cent arcade in the subway in 42nd Street, and they were publishing my drawings of the president. Years later, the art director said to me, you know, Harry, they only hire people with Ivy League degrees here now. So everything changed. But the 70s were this wonderfully open time. I mean, there I was naively and innocently walking into Manhattan and walking into SoHo and walking into the New York Times. I was incredibly fortunate. And getting a place down here was like a scholarship. So I decided that since I had all these incredible things happening, that I should work incredibly hard, that it was a calling. This was a calling, not a vocation. And I had a religious sense of it, that I should absolutely work as hard until I dropped. I would regard these illustration jobs like a racehorse. And I would put on blinders and I would run to the finish line and run with everything I had until the deadline was accomplished and I could just drop. Because as you can see here, in the early days, I was working with cross-hatching. This is a drawing of the Pope, and now here I was trying to deal with the fact that in those days, if they did a detailed drawing, they would have to screen it. By a screen, I mean they would put a crude dot matrix over the drawing, and as you can see, it makes it grayer and more indistinct. Unfortunately, newspapers had gone from a grand state of printing in the 1940s to a very poor state of reproduction in the 70s. The newsprint was no better than toilet paper. Where they used to use zinc plates, they were now using plastic plates. If you look at a picture of the Daily News in the 1940s in the printing galley, there's hundreds of people working there. It looks like a troop ship from World War I. And by the time I worked there, they'd fired everybody and were just looking for ways to make it cheaper and cheaper. So I developed a technique of working with stipple, with dots. And you can see this is more black and white, and they were able to print that directly. But it was tremendously labor consuming because a million dots. And you know, when I met my wife, I said, every dot is a decision. So I'd stay up all night like making these dots. This was a drawing I did about the nuclear disarmament, and I was trying to impress the copy girl at the time, who was 19 years old and very pretty. So I had drawn a dinosaur in Parade magazine, and I carried in a stack of them to impress her, but nobody heard of Parade magazine in New York. And it had a circulation of 45 million, but nobody had heard of it. Furthermore, the dinosaur sued me. Turned out that I had used a drawing from the Museum of Natural History because what do I know about what a dinosaur looks like? I didn't realize that people were hired to draw these dinosaurs. So we got sued. And if you Google my name now, there's still some guy on the internet who says that I ripped off his Brontosaurus. So anyway, I'm there with my dinosaur in my parade magazines, and the phone rings, and the art director of the Week in Review section, and the editor yells out, "Pincus, get in here, it's a phone call." So I said to the copy girl, "Well, it's either my mother or the White House." And he yells out, "Get in here, it's the White House!" And it was the chief of the SALT talks, and he wanted to distribute this drawing all through the White House. This is a drawing I did for Nat Hentoff at the Village Voice, the late great Nat Hentoff. And it's a Hitler with a "We the People" t-shirt. Now, I can't think of any modern political figure that I would put in there. I can't, can you? Could anyone think of somebody today who might remind you of that? Oh, this is this was a very fine publication. Actually, Screw Magazine was an offshoot of the Underground papers. Oh, I should tell you, my first illustration job I got from my mother. My mother was called the Jewish Mother from Central Casting. And she was working in a wig store in Canarsie, my aunt and uncle's wig store. And she told me, I was in SVA for a year, and she told me she had a job for me. I said, "What kind of a job?" She said, "It's a book cover, stupid." And she gave me an address, and she didn't tell me what kind of a book cover it was. So the address was at 214 Lafayette Street, right over here. That is now a multi-million-dollar building, which was recently owned by a film producer with a swimming pool inside. But when I got there in 1975, it was a warehouse. And she told me to look for a guy named Nat. So I said, "How do I know who Nat is?" And she says, "He's one of our customers. He's wearing a wig." So I walk in and I see a bunch of boxes. It's 5-star distributors, and there's a guy with a full toupee. And I asked him if he's Nat, and he said, "Yeah." And I said, I'm here for an illustration job. Would you like to see my art portfolio?" And he said, "Oh, you're Blanche's son." So I said, "Yeah." He says, "I don't have to look at that. It's the job. Did she tell you what kind of job it is?" I said, "Well, she said it's a book cover." She said, "Yeah, it's a book cover." He says, $50. It's called Pussy Licking Country Boy." That was my first job. It was supposed to take place in a recording studio. And one of my next jobs, I went to the SoHo News over here on Spring Street. And I brought along the French girlfriend, but I didn't want her to come in with me because I didn't want to look like I had to be escorted in. I wanted to go in like a big boy. So she was standing outside of the window like an urchin looking in. And I walked in with my portfolio, and there was an angelic-looking gentleman at the desk. And as soon as I presented my work, somebody ran up to him and screamed every profanity imaginable and picked up his garbage can and dumped all the garbage on his head. And I'm standing, and silence in the SoHo News. And I'm standing there in front of this guy who's got a halo of garbage all over his desk. Silence. I didn't know what to say, and I wanted to sound sophisticated, so I said, "I've never seen anyone speak to an art director like that before." As if I'd ever seen anyone speak to an art director. And he looked up at me and he said, "I also happen to be the publisher." And that was Michael Goldstein. So I worked for the SoHo News. All of these papers evolved out of the East Village Other and the tradition of underground papers. And we didn't work for Screw for the money. We worked there for the Christmas parties. Al Goldstein had a Christmas party every year at the Belmore Cafeteria on 28th Street. That's the restaurant that's in Taxi Driver, the cafeteria in Taxi Driver. And Al Goldstein was a wonderfully rotund Jewish entrepreneur who so antagonized everybody that he ended up homeless, unfortunately. But Al was at the top of his powers when I worked there. And when you went to the Christmas party at the Belmore Cafeteria, they gave you a ticket, and you walked in, and you walked past all of these crazy minor celebrities, and you would get anything you wanted at the steam table. This was a Jewish boy's dream, or as Al would say, wet dream. And there were kasha varnishkas, and flanken, and pastrami, and pastries, and every dessert you'd fill up with. And then you'd go to the middle room. And the middle room was where all the porn stars were showing off their wares. So you'd be eating your cake and standing there with the director of Deep Throat and Harry Reams, and you're stuffing your face with cake and kasha varnishkas. And then when you had that, you'd go, next door was an Irish bar. So you'd go to the Irish bar, have a drink, come back, go to the porn stars, and then back to get more cake. So we all worked there for the parties. You had parties at Plato's Retreat. And you would meet celebrities in very strange positions. So this was the old, wonderful New York of the 70s. And down here, there were parties every weekend. I was friends with a guy named John Wilcock, who was one of the founders of the Village Voice. And every Saturday night, I'd call John up, and I'd say, hey, John, it's Harry. I hear there's a party at 2 Bond Street. And John would say, well, Larry Rivers is having something again, and there's something Lafayette Street, those are always there. And we would trade party addresses, and you'd have at least 3 or 4 loft parties to go to, and you'd walk in with a 35-cent Miller High Life in a paper bag or a Roach or something, and you were in. And it was SoHo, and it was fantastic, and we would all see each other, a strange group of people at openings and things, and that went on for quite a while until Ronald Reagan was elected. I lived in Paris for a year. And I had a vision of Mao Zedong dying. And while I was working on this thing, they had earthquakes in China and hundreds of thousands of people died. But I didn't know that. And when I heard that Mao actually died, I went running all over Paris trying to print my etching plate. And I finally found an atelier with an etching press that was hundreds of years old. And the man who was working the etching press had an original plate by Daumier. And he let me print my etching where the Daumier plate had been. So anyway, I ran into Libé with that, and they said, oh, mais Harry, Mao est mort. And I said, I know, I have an etching. And they printed it. This is an etching of a girl on the roof, my roof. That's a copper plate etching. And I sold etchings on the street for about 15 years. And it was a wonderful way for people who didn't have a lot of money to buy an original work of art. What an etching is it's a multiple, but no two are alike. So it's an original in the sense that it's not exactly like anything else. And I would sell them for $30 or $40 on the street. And it's an incredible thing to go to someone's house today and see my etching on the wall from many years ago. I lived in the South Bronx for a while. I drove a cab, and I got held up on New Year's Eve in a place that looked like that. So that was very real to me. These are etchings. This is a couple of friends of mine who didn't live very long. They were a doomed couple. I also drew them in the Village Voice. These people are still around, sort of. This was when Reagan won. The Daily News hired me to draw Jimmy Carter coming out of a revolving door. It was called the revolving door presidency. So I went down to the telephone building on West Broadway with my Polaroid, and I took a picture of the revolving door. And a guy was coming out with the Daily News. And he said, what are you taking my picture for? I said, excuse me, sir. I see you read the Daily News. If you pick up the Sunday News and you look at the paper, there'll be a drawing of Jimmy Carter coming out of this door, and you'll be Jimmy Carter. And he said to me, I am Jimmy Carter. So I said, what do you mean? And he takes out his employee ID card. His driver, his name was Jimmy Carter.
That's funny.
This was an election of '84, Ronaway, and I was doing all the faces of the electorate for the New York Times Weekend Review. And at the same time, the Daily News called me, so I went running across 42nd Street. I guess that was the height of my career. I mean, imagine I was doing the election covers of both the Daily News and the Times. And when I went to the Daily News, I said, give me all your Mondales and give me all your Reagans. And they said, Harry, it's for the day after the election. It's Reagan Bush. I said, no, man, you don't know. You don't know. Give me your Mondales. Harry, it's Reagan Bush. And that day I called up and I said, it's going to be an upset. Let me get up there and draw Mondale. They said, Harry, we're going to have sandwiches. We're going to have drinks. Relax. I went to sleep. I woke up and my friends called me and I went up to the Limelight. And everyone on the bus on the way up to the Limelight had this cover. When I got up to the Limelight, Dave Winfield of the Yankees was standing outside the club holding this thing. So it was, And they put it up in their lobby, and I used to take girls on dates to the Daily News lobby, and they didn't know why, and it was to show them my election card. Big thing on the lobby. The Daily News was like the history of newspapers. There was a guy there who named Jimmy Delahanty, and he was an old man, and everybody ridiculed him. Jimmy Delahanty had written a travel column on Printers Row for William Randolph Hearst in the 1920s. And he knew everyone. He'd say something like, "That's where Damon Runyon's desk was." And I'd say, "Damon Runyon, that was a person?" He said, "Yeah, he was my friend." And he was friends with Seeger, who invented Popeye. And as they told me, Jimmy was a good-looking Irish kid when he was young, so Seeger used to dress him up as a sailor and take him out bar hopping and introduce him to everybody as Popeye, my son. And it was amazing to hear these stories of the great newspapers. And this was a series I did, which won a big award about New York's lost teenagers for the Daily News. The Daily News was great in that I could draw a kind of realism that wasn't available to the New York Times, which were these, real tabloid sort of things. That's my wife, but I'm not beating her, though. This was my agent. He was very frustrated with me because he got me a job for $3,000, and I turned it down because it was advertising South African tourism, the height of apartheid. Yes. Yeah, I mean, I never regretted that. He was going to kill me, too. He didn't understand why. I saw what I was doing as a calling. At one point, I was called into an ad agency. I gave the art director a lecture about how bad cigarette advertising was. So he thought I was funny, and he called in everybody to listen to me. And I got up and I spoke to all the art people in this ad agency about the evils of advertising. And when I was finished, they gave me a standing ovation. No job, but a standing ovation. Then I did jazz posters for Lincoln Center, which was fantastic because I got to work with these people, and these guys were so great, like they glowed. I had a friend who was a beat poet named Ted Jones, Joans, and Ted Jones came to New York in the late 40s and actually lived with Charlie Parker. And Ted did a thing called Rent a Beatnik in the 50s. I once said to Ted, "Did you know Kerouac?" And he said, "Harry, I knew Kerouac better than I know Harry Pincus." And once I was walking past Via Margita on 4th Street with him, and he said, "Let me look in there, wait a second." And he said, "Oh, it looks the same as it did when I had dinner here with James Dean and Bird." So I said to him, "You had dinner with James Dean? What was James Dean like?" And he was very offended because he said James Dean was here to see what we were like. So in the 70s, he did an abstract art show for the Jazz Museum. And he lived in Africa half the year, so I took his concept of a design and I made it into these heads, and I did these jazz posters for Lincoln Center. Want one more story? Well, I sold my etchings on the street for 15 years, and my mother would come out, and sometimes she'd come out and my father would come out and they would argue on the street, but people would come to see the Jewish mother nagging the artist. It became a tradition in the Washington Square Outdoor Art Show. So one day it was about 100 degrees and it was the end of the day and everyone had packed up. And I see Bob Dylan. He was with another guy. He's wearing, it was 100 degrees, and he's wearing a leather bomber jacket and a hoodie and Ray-Bans, and he's walking in the street, and he's with another guy. He's like, the record guy, the record mop, like a young, sharp guy in a suit, And I went running over, and you can see I'm a very shy person. And I very quietly approached him. According to Monica, I dropped to one knee, and I said, "It's you! I always wanted to meet you!" My brain was, I would go out on the street all day after pulling all-night deadlines. I was fried. So Dylan just stopped and didn't say a word, and the other guy looked at me like he was going to kill me. And I thought, maybe that jacket's a bulletproof vest. Maybe he's afraid of people like me. So I told him that I was Phil Oak's friend, and I was Ratzo's friend, and it was okay, and that he'd given me so much, and I had all of my etchings, and I would like to give him one. And he goes, all right. Now I'm walking with Bob Dylan. and this is my dream. I'm going to show Bob Dylan my work. And we get there, and I realize I've taken all my work down. It's not there. It's in milk crates in the trunk of my father's car. So meanwhile, my mother was there with her friend Belle, who had been a showgirl in the 20s in Brooklyn. And Belle was brought there by my mother for one purpose, which was she was carrying 2 shopping bags full of tuna fish. And Belle had a mantra that day, and her mantra was, "Harry, take the tuna fish. It's good tuna fish." So Bob Dylan walks past my mother and Belle, and he sees the 2 old Jewish ladies and the tuna fish, and all right, and he starts looking through etchings in the back of the car. So I pull out my biggest, most expensive etching, and I said, "Here, would you like this?" And now my mother hears that I'm going to give somebody an etching, and she thinks Bob Dylan is a bum. So now my mother, with her walker, is standing behind Bob Dylan, gesturing wildly. "Get rid of him, he's a bum." And it's hard to talk to Bob Dylan with your mother standing over his shoulder, gesticulating, "Get rid of him, he's a bum." Dylan didn't want that etching, but he picked this drawing out of the trunk of the car. And this was something I had done for the first détente for the Washington Post. And he said, "How much is this?" Now, this was a one-of-a-kind drawing. I hadn't slept for 3 days. And the first words out of my mouth were, "Oh, I wasn't going to sell that." And Dylan put it down and said, "I'll be back," and turned and walked away. So it took me hours to realize I'd blown off Bob Dylan. So I'm just going to conclude with one quick story, and that is just that the New York Times asked me to do a drawing of a little girl and her nanny. And the little girl was my daughter Rachel, who was 2 years old. And it was published on my father's 80th birthday. And they had a little surprise party for him. And he came up to the party. He could barely walk by then. And he opened up that newspaper like it was the heavyweight championship belt of the world. And 3 weeks later, he was gone. Thank you very much.
I put out my hand.